Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 26th of June, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me by video link, we have Vanessa Bealey from Damascus and Charles Mallet. Welcome to the programme, both. We are going to kick off with the release yesterday of Julian Assange. He was released from Belmarsh prison. He had been there since 2019. He got on a chartered aircraft, which flew him to Bangkok initially and then to Saipan, which is apparently an unincorporated organized territory of the United States. And there he had took part in a court hearing. I'm sure everybody knows this by now, but anyway, he pled guilty to one charge. He was due to be sentenced to 5 years in prison, and with time served, he was released. And well, you've just seen him getting off the aircraft again in Australia. So Assange out of prison. Well, I guess we can have a discussion about that. But if we look at this, what was the BBC's response? Campaigner or attention seeker? So first of all, Charles, I don't know what your thoughts are here, but does the average attention seeker, do they spend 14 years in incarceration of various types?
Good afternoon, Mike. Good afternoon, all. I don't think they do. No, I think that's extremely unfair and really deflective sort of look at it by the BBC. And I think the question really now should not be about his current predicament, but should be a chance to go over what has happened to him, what did happen, and to have some redress for him, but also to be able to make sure that that cannot happen to anybody again.
Well, indeed. Now, the Australian government seems to have had quite a role to play on this. Now, of course, historically they haven't, but there has been a change of government in Australia, and the new regime there seems to have been a bit more proactive about sorting this out. So whether their latest actions, including delegations sent to the United States Congress at the end of last year and so on, whether that had anything to do with it, I'm not sure. Of course, we can't underestimate the campaign that's been run over the last number of years by WikiLeaks and their supporters. But the other issue here, Vanessa, is, as Charles has just said, we shouldn't sort of try to deflect away from what Assange has actually done. I mean, what are your thoughts about the contribution that he's made?
Well, he's done everything that the BBC has never done. I mean, he's held power to account, and he's also enabled through the WikiLeaks files journalists that are looking to hold power to account. He's enabled them to do so. And I mean, you know, we don't have the time right now to go through the very long history of information that has been used for good, basically, from the WikiLeaks platform. So, you know, that's the bottom line, really. He's done what all journalists and legacy media should be doing, and which none of them do. And that's why he's vilified.
Indeed. And a lot of the naysayers that I've seen on social media so far, Vanessa, are focusing on the alleged sexual improprieties and trying to deflect again away from the release of the documentation itself. You know, at the end of the day, he has apparently pled guilty to a charge of actually inciting the release of documentation. So the argument of the other side in this court case is that it wasn't that he was just handed documents by whistleblowers, but he actually incited that handing over of whistleblowers. There's got to be a massive public interest case in this, or justification.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And also, of course, we shouldn't forget the timing, just coming up to Biden's election. And you know, there's going to be all sorts of different spins and different interests involved in trying to spin this story. But I think, you know, we just have to keep a focus on the good that Julian Assange did. His statements that, as I've said, have exposed really, you know, the criminals in this world, and bear that in mind at all times.
Yes.
Anything else is distraction.
Indeed. Now, just to sort of finish this off, Charles, I just was going to, because we're going to come on to independent candidates later on, and who should be the next Prime Minister, perhaps. But I just thought we should highlight this, and let's bring this on screen, because this is an excerpt from a book called Secret Power by Stefano Marizzi, while making the point here that it was the Crown Prosecution Service, a public authority then headed by Keir Starmer, which had helped create the legal paralysis and diplomatic quagmire responsible for Julian Assange's arbitrary detention. So that, I guess, gives us Keir Starmer's involvement in the Julian Assange case, Keir Starmer's involvement in some of the prosecutions over the Horizon IT scandal that continues. The inquiry continues on that at the moment, and also the Jimmy Savile case. So Keir Starmer, it seems, doesn't have a great reputation with respect to judicial matters, and the question is he qualified to be Prime Minister?
Well, I don't know that his background with the CPS could be directly overlaid to any sort of political capability, but it doesn't look like he's somebody that is able to confront issues that have blighted his past, or at least should be viewed as having blighted his past. And this doesn't seem to have cropped up nearly enough during the inquisition of him as an individual or his election campaign. And if he's going to put himself forward as somebody who's sort of made a difference to the country in the past, then that needs to be examined and scrutinized. He needs to accept the consequences. But no, I wouldn't say that based on his apparent leadership of the CPS as DPP that he's covered himself in anything like glory.
No, indeed. Okay, well, so congratulations to Assange. Some people, sorry, just to finish this off, Vanessa, some people will be perhaps disappointed that there may be a precedent set here by him accepting this guilty plea on a single charge. But it seems to me that if there's going to be any criticism there, then people need to also have spent certainly several years in Belmarsh and a lot of years in another form of incarceration before that, before any criticism is levelled.
Absolutely. Walk in his shoes. I think that's, it's a very unfair criticism. Look, as I said, look at what he's achieved, look at what he's done, look at what he's gone through, and leave the guy alone. I'm only sad, actually, that John Pilger didn't live to see this day. I think he would have been overjoyed.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to another serious issue at the moment, and that is the situation with respect to Lebanon and Israel. The Daily Telegraph has been behaving not terribly correctly here.
Yes, I think a call should be made to Mariana Spring of BBC Verify to follow through on this story. Quite extraordinary, actually, from the Telegraph. And I just want to mention that this afternoon we're receiving reports of Israel claiming that it's making preemptive strikes on southern Lebanon. We can only assume that means preemptive, pre-invasion. It remains to be seen, of course, if Israel will actually carry through with the invasion, but it's very intense bombardment that is currently ongoing. So anyway, a few days ago, the Telegraph produced quite an extraordinary article making a claim. It had no byline. It's written anonymously. It's full of anonymous sources. Hezbollah stores missiles and explosives at Lebanon's main airport, whistleblowers claim. Of course, no mention of the fact that the US is bringing missiles and weapons into Lebanon via the same Rafik Hariri airport in Beirut. So what are they actually claiming? They're claiming that effectively Hezbollah is storing huge quantities of Iranian weapons, missiles, and explosives in the main civilian airport. They say that also at the airport is the AT-14 Cornet. Well, by the way, that's manufactured in Syria, and Syria really doesn't need to fly it into Beirut. It can be transported across border. The disclosures will raise fears that the Rafik Hariri airport, just 4 miles from the city center, could become a major military target. Well, you don't say. The fact that the Telegraph actually produced this article at this stage in the conflict between southern Lebanon and Israel is absolutely criminal, in my opinion. They then made the claim that a security source at the International Air Transport Association told the Telegraph, "We have been aware of this for years, but we are unable to do anything without international legal action. We are hand-tied to do what we'd really like, which is to close the airport and have all the weapons and explosives remove. Absolutely fake news, fake attribution of this citation. So let's have a look at what the IATA actually said in a statement to the National News Agency, which is basically the official Ministry of Information in Lebanon. The quote is completely false and misattributed. IATA has not made and will not make any comments on the situation at Beirut airport. We've no involvement in the political or security situation in Lebanon and would never comment on such matters. We alerted the Telegraph to the error, and the newspaper has since updated the article, removing IATA's name. Well, yes, they did remove the section which mentioned IATA, but with absolutely no retraction, absolutely no explanation of why the article was not only altered in its text, but also in the headline too. Beirut airport bosses deny it's being used to store Hezbollah weapons. And what is particularly dishonest, if you go to the original URL and click on it, you arrive at the new article with no explanation, no retraction, no update, no apology. Lebanon's caretaker minister of Public Works and Transport, Ali Hamni, this is from Al Mayadeen, proclaimed that Beirut airport has been subjected to disinformation for years, adding that instead of publishing a ridiculous and baseless report citing anonymous sources, the British Daily should have opted for checking in with the British Department of Transport, which conducted a field visit of the airport on January the 22nd, 2024. Incredible dereliction of journalistic ethics and duty by the Telegraph. Greg Carstrom, the Economist Middle East correspondent, I'd love to know the backstory of who at the Telegraph decided to publish something so transparent that no one, even our foreign staff, was willing to put their name to it. Lebanon's caretaker Minister of Information, Zaid Makari, accused the Telegraph's article in a post on X of contradicting the principles and ethics of journalism, and called on all media outlets not only to denounce it, but also to expose the goals behind its publication in these circumstances, in particular, stressing that they are not innocent. I would agree with that. The Telegraph is complicit in any escalation that includes the bombing of a civilian airport in the center of Beirut. This is translated from Arabic in Al Akhbar. Diplomatic and media tour of the airport facilities was immediately organized, and British Foreign Office staff in Beirut denied any collusion with the Telegraph and basically distanced themselves from the Telegraph, which is kind of interesting because we know that the Telegraph pretty much works hand in glove with intelligence agencies in the UK. So this was a quick report by actually a reporter from the National News Agency, so not affiliated to Hezbollah, during the visit to the airport.
Lebanon's transportation minister has called for an open tour of the Beirut International Airport after the British newspaper The Telegraph published an anonymously sourced and anonymously written article alleging that the Lebanese Hezbollah group is smuggling and stockpiling all manner of weapons in the international airport. So we've been walking from warehouse to warehouse, where, as you can see behind me, there are stockpiles of various boxes. We've even searched in some of the boxes, and so far there are no weapons to be found. The Telegraph article alleging all sorts of weapons in the civilian airport has caused critics to be concerned that the newspaper may be manufacturing consent for a potential Israeli strike on the airport, which Israel has done in the past. This comes at a time of heightened conflict, one might say already a war that has erupted between Israel and Hezbollah and its allied militias, although there are fears that it could be stoked into a larger all-out and maybe even regional war.
It's also interesting, the reaction from Israeli media, which of course is to bolster the story. This is just from two selections, the Times of Israel and Ynet, but you can see that they've immediately run with the story with the potential of using it as justification for bombing, I repeat, a civilian airport that has tens of thousands of people going through it every day. The Air Transport Union in Lebanon denied in a statement the Telegraph's report in which it claimed that Hezbollah stores missiles. The UTA called the Telegraph's unfounded claims mere illusions and lies aimed at endangering Beirut airport, its civilian workers, as well as travelers to and from it, all of whom are civilians. So, I mean, I repeat again, this is extraordinarily criminal action by the Telegraph. And in fact, Lebanon is now talking about suing the Telegraph for damaging the reputation of Beirut's main airport. And in the text of the article, it talks about putting civilian lives at severe risk. And if we just remember, when we're talking about journalistic integrity, I just found this video by chance looking at Telegraph's Twitter page back in 2020 when they were running a COVID fake news campaign. And this is what they said in one of the videos that made up that campaign.
So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some of it's produced by people who are intentionally seeking to mislead, some of it by people who are inadvertently misleading. The truth is, the best way to know if the information you're getting is right is if it comes from a credible source, for example, the NHS or the government, and it's being reported in a reputable news source, like the Telegraph.
Well, I mean, you know, Mike, I'm smiling, but honestly, this has kind of blown me away with how dishonest and downright criminal lack of reporting this is. That was a complete fantasy report put out to effectively, as I said, to provide the pretext for Israel to bomb a civilian airport. They should be hauled over the coals.
Yeah, I mean, in 2017, 2018, whenever it was, when you and I were running events, media and trial events, we were focusing on the British media's coverage of Syrian war, for example, and the types of tactics. But even in Syria, we didn't see this. This is well beyond anything they did even in other conflicts that we had an interest in.
Yeah, I mean, the Telegraph was also taking part in the vilification of the Syrian government, which effectively was a pretext for the murder of Syrian civilians, the occupation of their territory, and murderous attacks on the Syrian Arab army inside Syria, and 13, coming up to 14 years, war, sanctions, etc. But yeah, I mean, this, even after their exposure as fraudulent media multiple times. And if you remember, they were actually running the headline that Saddam had moved his weapons of mass destruction into Syria. So this isn't the first time. That was back in 2004, at the same time that the BBC's Juliet Harkin, BBC Media in Action, was infiltrating Syrian society to basically encourage opposition. So, you know, these media outlets at some point have got to be held accountable for the role they've played in genocide in Gaza, but also in mass atrocities carried out by the UK regime globally.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, if we're talking about war drums and the banging of war drums, that's not the only intervention that the British media plays. The other is election interference, Charles.
Yes, and not just the British media. I mean, last week I spoke about the feeling of disenfranchisement across the electorate and the record number of independent candidates that are going to be standing in this general election. But what I'd like to look at today are some of the obstacles presented to those candidates and effectively what looks like a deliberate engineering of the system in order to suppress independent candidates, of course, because they cannot be controlled in the same way that candidates or indeed MPs belonging to a political party can be. So just a couple of headlines from local newspapers talking about independent candidates not invited to hustings. But I just want to give the background to this. And of course, the Electoral Commission, whilst writing about how to conduct or hold hustings, make it very clear that there are, of course, two different types. So they say that some hustings cannot be reasonably regarded as intended to promote any parties or candidates over any others. We call this a non-selective hustings. And there's therefore a spending implication, or at least declaration on that. But in addition to non-selective, the guidance also explains situations in which hustings can be reasonably regarded as intended to promote the candidates or parties who attend. We call this a selective hustings. In this case, either the hustings organiser or the candidates or parties may need to account for the spending. Now, that therefore is that actually it's not the Electoral Commission that dictates who would be invited to hustings, it's the organiser. And we'll just have a run through of some of the possibilities or some of the slants on hustings, which might dictate exactly why independent candidates wouldn't be asked. So first of all, we'll look at Friends of the Earth. So obviously there's going to be an environmental bent to hustings organised by Friends of the Earth. We've then got from West Coast Today, the Oban hustings. Election candidates speak on LGBTQ plus and local issues. Then the Operation Black Vote, hosting a national series of political hustings. Then we go to the Muslim Council of Britain, hustings at mosques, and then Jewish community hustings written up for the general election 2024. So the point about that is that there is, in effect, no control mechanism by which an independent candidate may squeeze themselves into these selective hustings. So that's the first part of it. The second part, as Mike says, is the media coverage. And this is governed by Ofcom and effectively is tantamount to censorship of independent candidates by means of the guidance that they have written down, or at least the rules they've written down in Elections and Referendums, Section 6. So particularly Section 6.2, due weight must be given to the coverage of parties and independent candidates during the election period. In determining the appropriate level of coverage to be given, broadcasters must take into account evidence of past electoral support and or current support. Well, of course, that's rather a closed loop, because if it's an independent candidate that hasn't stood before, there will be no evidence of past electoral support. And if the media or broadcasters have not previously been reporting accurately the level of support for an independent candidate, then they're absolutely trapped. And Ofcom will perpetuate that cycle. It goes on, Rule 6.2, due weight must be given to designated organisations in coverage during the referendum period. Broadcasters must also consider giving appropriate coverage to other permitted participants with significant views and perspectives. Now, that is a very, effectively ambiguous statement in which it might be interpreted in any way. Permitted participants with significant views and perspectives. Well, who judges that? There's guidance on this. And of course, Ofcom actually clarified by saying it's an editorial decision for the broadcaster as to what constitutes appropriate coverage in relation to Rule 6.2. The concept of giving due weight as required by Rule 6.2 is flexible. Its application depends on the electoral context. So it's quite clear to see that the system is such that the independent candidates may be shut out at will, not just by the organisers of hustings, but also by the broadcasters. And the other thing I just thought we'd look at, given that it's Pride Month, there's been some talk about the Labour manifesto and what they've put out about transgender people, and they're calling this respect and opportunity for all. That's the heading they've given this. But I just want to highlight the hypocrisy of it. They say so-called conversion therapy is abuse. There is no other word for it. So Labour will finally deliver a full trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices while protecting the freedom for people to explore their sexual orientation and gender identity. Of course, given that it is Pride Month and given that there is a wave of targeted propaganda at particularly young people with the apparent benefit of being able to change gender at will, the fact that they are describing conversion therapy as abuse is telling, and of course back to front, because in effect what they're allowing for is conversion therapy, or at least is the absolute encouragement of people to change gender in the first place. They then go on to say they'll modernise, simplify and reform the intrusive and outdated gender recognition law to a new process, will remove indignities for trans people who deserve recognition and acceptance, whilst retaining the need for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria from a specialist doctor, enabling access to the healthcare pathway. Now, there are many issues that crop up there, but I think the main thing that's never concentrated on in this debate are these supposed healthcare professionals who are actually providing a diagnosis and giving, in effect, a clinical recognition to this that puts them on the so-called healthcare pathway. And these are the people that need to be held to account, and very seldom are they ever mentioned.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that, Charles. Okay. If you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, you can do so at support.ukcolumn.org. The options are there. Membership is £5 a month. We do need your support. If you can do that, please help us out. But do share it, material you find on the various platforms, not Facebook, but certainly ukcolumn.org and ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. You could pick something up at the UK Column shop. And I will say again, a massive thank you to everybody that's grabbed a copy of Your Life in Their Hands. If you haven't got a copy of this yet, we are encouraging everybody, especially members, to get a copy. We want this distributed as far and wide as we possibly can. So if you haven't got a copy yet, please do get hold of one. Okay, we have the interview you did, Charles, with Mark Byford on the website.
Yeah, it's a terrific interview. It's got very good feedback so far. Mark is a farmer in Suffolk, and he's a rare breed because he has a very clear idea of what's gone wrong in terms of farming practices and the control mechanisms, but also destruction of the environment. But he has practical means by which this can be changed, both at the sort of bigger farm level, but also at the individual level, how you can get involved and take control of your own food supply. So I'd really encourage you to listen to that.
Thank you. And tomorrow at 1 p.m, Debbie will be speaking to Ursula Edgington, who is from New Zealand, and they're going to be covering all the COVID-related stuff that happened in New Zealand and what's happened since. So join us for that at 1 p.m. tomorrow. A date for your diary: Saturday, the 19th of October, 2024, in Bristol. We will be holding a really live event, and so we will be there, and the venue will be announced much closer to the time, but keep an eye out for further information about this. And then for the final time now, the Sounds Beautiful Festival in Wimborne and Dorset begins, tomorrow. And I think Kenny is already there today, but we will all be there for that. So if you're joining us for that, please, we hope to see you and look forward to meeting you. Okay, now, Charles, where does that take us? That takes us to, are we being killed by cattle?
Well, this is it, the relentless push to convince us that all livestock is not just deadly, but also destructive to the environment. So we start with an announcement that DEFRA have just reported on African swine fever in pigs and wild boars in Europe. Of course, you won't be surprised to know this amounts to one case of a wild boar in Western Germany for the first time. Nonetheless, that has made them concentrate on development of a vaccine for African swine flu. Of course, this is only possible because of the use of the PCR test. So this is in effect the COVID model being put on to livestock. And then we look at the Pirbright Institute, which we've spoken about a number of times before, and they run a course, lab diagnosis of African swine fever, conveniently enough, in which you will be able to learn how to isolate ASF virus and apply diagnostic methods. So it's little coincidence to find that Pirbright Institute are also joining the European Swine Fever Project, which is going to be developing new technologies for African swine fever vaccines. Here we see at the European Commission. On top of that, we've got avian influenza recorded in Australia. Again, absolute bare minimum of evidence, but still it's enough to put out a press release about it. And this, again, is meant to make people swallow the idea of the spread of something, not just from one creature to another, but also from one species to another, and then, of course, on to humans. So they talk about H5 and H5N1 having spread among seabirds, and of course, in the Falklands, then we go back to the elephant seals earlier in the year. So they're now prepared for detections in Australia, despite the absolute minimal evidence of 5 cases, again, by PCR test. Further, we've got on the environmental side of it, Denmark yesterday has just put through a carbon tax on agriculture. And again, seems to be a push to eliminate livestock from people's lives. This came from an earlier policy paper, February 2023, the adaptation of Danish farm sector to a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. And in effect, it does leave people begging the question that McGill University did ask, which is, why isn't the carbon dioxide from breathing a concern for global warming? Meaning, if animals are to be attacked for effectively breathing, why are humans not subject to the same treatment? But the answer seems to be that carbon dioxide we inhale does not contribute to global warming for the simple reason that we also take up an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide from the air, albeit indirectly. No one really seems to be able to explain why animals aren't regarded in the same light. But the point here to consider really is that despite the absolute absence of any sort of coherent science, we are continually being pushed to consider that we should eliminate meat from our diets, that livestock are no good for the environment, and that we are likely to catch disease off them, or that they will spread disease among each other. So this is, of course, something that we have been looking at for a while and will keep very much keep an eye on, but particularly with regard to the push or the suggestion that these things can jump, not just geographically, but from species to species, despite absolute dearth of evidence.
Yes, but I would argue, Charles, they are absolutely encouraging us to believe that humans are contributing to global warming through breathing out, which is why they want to stop us breathing at all. And we'll come on to the war policy a bit more in a second. But in the meantime, of course, we have a situation, if we put this on screen, of the net zero policy being used to justify more and more lithium-ion batteries being created. And what we can see on screen here is the sparks and the eventual burning of lithium batteries in South Korea, in a manufacturing facility in South Korea. This killed 22 mostly Chinese migrant workers. It injured another 8. So this fire, as you can see, began after the batteries exploded. But then we, in a second, we'll move on to Glasgow, because in this case, well, that was South Korea. So let's have a look at the Glasgow video, and very similar kinds of pictures in terms of the smoke coming out of this. But this was on Sunday night. Firefighters at the scene to try to deal with this. This was a battery recycling facility. But the key thing here is that what did we see on social media afterwards? But we saw allegations that isn't it a coincidence that we had 2 such incidents happening very close together in time, and immediately after the Russian North Korean defense pact was done. And so the suggestion was that these 2 events were somehow linked to some kind of sabotage by the Russians. Well, I haven't seen that. While that was going out on social media, I didn't see that going out in mainstream media. But already we're starting to see the narrative start to build. So this is the Wall Street Journal, I believe, from a couple of days ago. Russian saboteurs behind arson attack on German factory. And I have to say, Charles, I find this really unbelievable. More nonsense, fake news from the mainstream press pushing a narrative. But the suggestion that lithium fires happening in factories, which these things happen on a fairly regular basis. And you've highlighted yourself the fact that the British Fire Service extremely concerned about, storage facilities in the countryside for storing energy in lithium ion batteries being a fire hazard, which is not understood. But we've got to divert our attention from that and look at Russia being responsible instead.
On the donkey. I mean, if you can nail Russia for it, then why not? Also, filling pages with this sort of stuff stops you from asking politicians real questions in the run up to the general election. But yes, I mean, what they should really be concentrating on here is how the United Kingdom is using lithium battery and battery storage facilities. And exactly like you say, we've pointed this out, and the fire services up and down the land have massive concerns. And you could tell from that video in Korea, you cannot put those fires out. So it's not just the fire, but it's also the environmental hazard during and after the fire. And there's just no regard given to this. There's absolutely no investigation of this policy to potentially destroy large swathes of the environment. And it's not going to get better.
Indeed. And just before you come on to your energy segment here, Charles, I just want to make the point. These fires can't be put out because once these batteries go on fire, they start generating their own oxygen supply. And that, of course, means that you can't easily put them out. You can't sort of smother them to create a barrier between the oxygen in the atmosphere and the fire, because it's generating its own oxygen. So it's really dangerous. But anyway, you have a segment on energy now.
I do, and that's it. But we should go into this considering the implications, which are that lithium is required in an awful lot of what are called renewable technologies. But I'm going to start with what's happening in London at the moment, which is the Breakthrough Energy Summit. And that, of course, is going to focus on all sorts of renewable technology. It may not surprise you to learn that Bill Gates happens to be the founder of Breakthrough Energy. So he's managed to come over here for this summit. But it's worth pointing out that a couple of weeks previously, he put a message on X saying that I've been waiting for this day for nearly 20 years. Today we broke ground on the first ever natrium plant in Kemmerer, Wyoming. This next generation nuclear power plant is a big step towards safe, abundant, zero carbon energy. So what we're going to look at is effectively what you're able to do with enough money and control to be able to shape policy in order to stimulate demand and then make money from the results. And Bill Gates also has an enterprise, conveniently enough, which is just referred to in Wyoming, called TerraPower, which is addressing surging global energy demand and preserving a sustainable future with the precise balance between renewable and nuclear energy. Now, this is not the first time it's been mentioned by UK column. Debbie Evans had this in her blog back in May 2023. But the significant development here, as far as Gates is concerned, are severalfold. First of all, on the business case, we've got the former Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy forecasting an enormous upsurge in nuclear power capacity and therefore demand for construction and capacity over the next few years up to 2035. So it's good timing from Bill Gates there. But the next thing to point out, of course, is that there is a health element to this. And TerraPower has TerraPower isotopes, which is what they're describing as nuclear innovation to advance new cancer treatments. And again, Debbie, and on UK column, we've spoken a lot about the massive push towards diagnostics, testing, and therefore treatments for cancer. So they're saying that there's a scarce global supply of actinium-225, an isotopic material in which they'll be able to, or with which they'll be able to support pharmaceutical companies' cancer research and development efforts. And just to cement that, they say that TerraPower and PanTerra, a lot of terror, announced strategic collaboration to accelerate across actinium-225. So again, good timing, because Macmillan Cancer Support show that there is a forecast. Admittedly, this does correlate very strongly with the rollout of new pharmaceutical products from the end of 2020 up to the present day. But also interesting, we see the drop-off of diagnoses, but a relatively flat line for death. So again, in terms of marketing, what Gates has to is being able to, in effect, by testing, sell a product based on a test result, as opposed to anybody necessarily being as ill as they might appear to be from the test. But just finally, we go to AstraZeneca, and they have announced that they have acquired just this month, June 2024, Fusion. And Fusion is part of AstraZeneca's oncology portfolio, with the addition of Fusion Pipeline of radioconjugates, including their most advanced program, a potential new treatment for patients with metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer, and brings new expertise in pioneering research and development, manufacturing and supply chain capabilities in actinium-based radioconjugates to AstraZeneca. So there we go. That's the whole circuit closed effectively by organizations like TerraPower, who are able to stimulate demand for such energy technology by shaping the policy, because they give the right amounts of money to the right organizations, and therefore we're driven down a renewable and nuclear channel. Then demand opens up for nuclear, and they have a sort of health derivative. So it's very well sewn up, and it'd be very interesting to see what the health service does on the cancer diagnostics and testing and indeed treatments as a result of this.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Vanessa, let's come back to you and what you were talking about at the beginning about Lebanon and the issue with Israel. Let's get some more detail on this.
Yeah, well, I think this is a dangerous part of what is happening in Lebanon right now, which of course is directly related to what is happening in Gaza. Hezbollah is fighting the Israeli forces in the north of the occupied territories to detract or to not allow the full force of the Israeli military to be used against Gaza. And of course, for them, the diplomatic solution is an end of the Zionist war against Gaza or genocide in Gaza. Now, what's interesting is that this article in Politico came out pretty much at the same time or just after the Telegraph. US to Hezbollah, don't count on us to stop an Israeli attack. Well, that can be translated as we endorse an Israeli attack inside the territory of Lebanon. US officials claiming to prevent a bigger Middle East war are leading an unusual or giving, sorry, I can't read that, warning to Hezbollah, don't assume that Washington can stop Israel from attacking you. Again, this is all, in my opinion, to basically put pressure on Hezbollah to end the conflict with the Israeli forces in the northern occupied territories. But if we then look at what they say at the end, it's not clear exactly what options Israel is considering against Hezbollah, which is not only heavily armed, but also wields political influence in Lebanon. This is an important point to make because, of course, the UK and the US, and I believe Canada, has designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization, when, of course, they are part of the political system in Lebanon. Sorry, can I just go back to that for 1 second?
Okay, yes, sorry.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, there you go.
Joint Chiefs Chair General C.Q. Brown has also had a warning for Israel. If a broader conflict erupts between Israel and Hezbollah, it may be more difficult for the US to help defend Israel compared with the April 13th missile barrage from Iran. That's because Hezbollah is geographically closer than Iran, but it's actually bordering the occupied territories, and therefore an attack requires a much shorter response time. And Hezbollah also has considerably more rockets and more sophisticated rockets than Hamas. And of course, we know that the IOF has so far failed to even dent the Hamas operations in Gaza. So then if we look at the fact that also various resistance factions in the region, including Iraqi leaders, vow to support Hezbollah if a war is waged against Lebanon. Iraqi Asayeb al-Haq leader Sheikh Qais Khazali threatened the US and stated that if they support Israel's attack on Lebanon, then all US interests in Iraq and the region will be a target. Similarly, a spokesman of the Iraqi resistance factions responsible for firing drones towards Israel announced that they are today operating from afar. If a war happens in Lebanon, they will go to Lebanon and use all available weapons at their disposal. And as I've mentioned before, Syria, that is currently supplying weapons to the resistance factions in the region, will of course then also be drawn directly into the conflict. Now, these were two reports, one from Declassified UK and one from Haaretz back in late October 2023, so only a few weeks after the October 7th. US military is secretly supplying weapons to Israel using the UK base on Cyprus. Just to give some context there, Cyprus gained its independence from Britain in 1960, but Britain retained control of what it calls its sovereign bases, 256 square kilometers. It's one of its largest military bases outside the UK. Cyprus also has an operational support unit which provides support to the British forces to protect UK strategic interests. So basically, let's come back to this. The US is moving arms in Israel from around Europe using Britain's airbase on Cyprus, but the Ministry of Defense refuses to tell Declassified what American aircraft are flying or what weapons are on board. And at the same time, Haaretz was also pointing out that Cyprus was being used as a launch pad for weapons and forces to be brought into not only Israel, but as it states, Lebanon has also seen the arrival of special flights from the US British, Canadian, German, Spanish, Dutch, and Italian air forces, so a fair amount of NATO member states in there. Some of these landed at a Lebanese Army Special Forces base near Tripoli, which is in the north of Lebanon, in an apparent attempt to prepare a forward operating base in case a mass rescue of their citizens from Lebanon is required due to a full-blown war between Israel and Hezbollah. Now, bear in mind, this was back in early November. The choice of location also indicates an assessment that in such a war, Beirut's international airport will not be used. Does that seem a little bit prescient to you? So let's have a look at where this forward base is being established. It's in the north, in Tripoli. And we know from previous news reports and research by myself particularly, that British intelligence have been operating heavily in Tripoli and setting up units there, establishing infiltration into Lebanese security, intelligence, and military, but particularly in Tripoli. So is this a forward base on the basis that if a war kicks off between Israel and Hezbollah, then NATO gets involved? This, again, was from Al-Mayadeen, a long history of military cooperation between Cyprus and Israel. It's reported regionally that Mossad has very close relations with Cyprus intelligence. Why is this all kicking off now? Because Sayed Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, has actually warned Cyprus specifically that opening its airports and bases to the enemy, Israel, to get Lebanon means that it has become part of the war and essentially becomes a target for the resistance factions. Now, in May 2023 and May and June 2023, there were joint Israeli Cypriot military drills actually, staging an invasion of Lebanon. So Cyprus did allow its territory, not only the sovereign bases, which can be claimed to be British, but it did use its own territory external to those bases. In response to the warning, Cypriot President Nikos Christodoulides, I've just murdered that, said on X that Cyprus does not participate in conflicts and is part of the solution, not part of the problem. But at the same time, Israel was eyeing a port in Cyprus. Back in March, Israel Hayam disclosed Israel's plan to purchase a port in Cyprus under the pretext of establishing an alternative supply route in case the Islamic resistance in Lebanon targets the port of Haifa. So we are looking now at a potential of real escalation between NATO member states and the regional resistance, in my opinion.
Yes, okay, thank you. Now let's move on to Ukraine. And on Monday, Brian just briefly mentioned the attack in Sevastopol, but let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. Now, this is the Telegraph's coverage of it. Crimea and Sumbia, they're struck by deadly shrapnel. Well, we'll look at the video clip in a second, and Vanessa, maybe you'll have a comment to make about whether it's, or maybe Charles, about whether it's shrapnel or not. This was CNN's coverage. At least 5 dead after missile fragments scatter over beachgoers in Russian-occupied Crimea. So let's just have a look at sorry, I do apologize. I've a bit trigger happy there with my finger. Let's have it. Yeah, we're having trouble today. Let's go back one and try again. Okay, you will see these things coming down. And Charles, I don't know, that looks more like just shrapnel. That looks like explosions taking place.
It does, absolutely, Mike. Yeah, it's very hard to believe that it would be fragments. I mean, it supposes a detonation in sort of, well, I mean, it's hard to see how that could be a detonation that would result in fragments landing exactly like that. So I don't see that's credible at all. I really don't.
Thank you. So basically, this looks like a cluster munition that's been used, but let's bring Matthew Miller on from the State Department. You've seen this a couple of times already, so apologies for that. I'll just tell you what the ambassador said when she met with the Russian Foreign Ministry, and that is, of course, that we lament any civilian loss of life in this war. Yeah, well, we believe him there, don't we? We provide weapons to Ukraine, he said, so it can defend its sovereign territory against armed aggression. He went on to say that includes in Crimea, which of course is part of Ukraine, and Russia could stop this war today and end the suffering caused by the war in Russia, by the war Russia launched today, if it would stop its occupation of sovereign Ukrainian territory and stop launching attacks on civilians. He went on to say, I don't have any assessment of the underlying attack, including who was responsible for it, but I will say you've seen Russia make ridiculous claims about responsibility in the past. It's not unusual for the government of Moscow to make ridiculous hyperbolic claims about responsibility that aren't borne out by any fact. The hypocrisy here is off the charts. But anyway, of course, what's he referring to? Russia absolutely clear that these weapons could not have been fired without US help. They are US supplied weapons. They are cluster munitions. Now, in TASS, they quote the EU as saying pretty much the same thing. They're saying that there's the EU claiming that there's zero credibility that the US was involved in targeting this. The Russians themselves say the use of US supplied ATACMS missiles will be discussed at the next regular briefing on Ukraine, which will be held in July, as we do every month. But Vasily Nebenzia here saying, they are absolutely claiming that these are US supplied and therefore US targeted weapons systems. This is from Italy, this particular report, and we'll do a quick translation on what it says here. So the headline is Russian attrition continues. Italy is right to talk about negotiations. But actually in this article, it quotes an Italian military expert and director of a particular organization that's qualified in these areas. I won't try to pronounce the name. I'm sorry, you'll have to look in the article to see that. And this person is quoted as saying the use of these weapons involves extensive US technical support. They're used with HIMARS launchers, and the attack is brought forward by a drone flying over the Black Sea. Drones take off from a Sicilian base at Sigonella and act as scouts and missile guidance. And he went on to say the US may have redeployed them from Greece. However, their main headquarters is in Italy, in Sigonella. They're long-range strategic reconnaissance drones called Global Hawk. So that's what's in the Italian media. In the meantime, here is the United Nations position on this from the UN Human Rights Office. Elizabeth Throssell here saying, while cluster munitions are not per se prohibited under international humanitarian law, it is the consistent position of the UN Human Rights Office that their use in populated areas is incompatible with fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. And I'm going to say thanks to Charles for this, because he sent me through this from the UK Manual on National Rules of Engagement. And it quotes here, calling for fire support. UK personnel engaged in multinational operations are able to continue to call for fire support using current procedures, even knowing that support may come from non-state parties in the form of cluster munitions. So that's that. And then from CSIS, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, making the point that the cluster munitions agreements are signed by 123 nations, came into effect in 2010, but that Russia, Ukraine and the United States have not signed the convention. And so perhaps that explains why the Department of Defense Law of War Manual that we talked about last week does authorize the use of cluster munitions, amongst other things. Now, Politico here reporting that France has deepened military ties with Germany and Poland. So another trilateral defense agreement done, this time between France, Germany and Poland. Now, of course, the problem here is that there's a snap election being called in France, so we see how that stands up following that. But this follows on from the report we did a couple of weeks ago on military mobility and PESCO and so on, and the fact that a whole raft of European countries, 22 EU member states, have signed the agreement on military mobility. And this is all about getting effectively US and British arms and personnel from the west coast of Europe to the east coast in order to do battle with Russia. I say that with tongue in cheek because they'll get annihilated if they try it. But anyway, in the meantime, the wonderful Hamish de Breton Gordon has been up to his old tricks again. His headline in the Telegraph, once again, we're getting the Telegraph in as many times as possible today. Putin's nuclear arsenal is crumbling. Ukraine can take it out for good, is what he's claiming. So therefore, we don't need to worry. We can just go ahead and use nuclear weapons against Russia if we choose to do so. But in the meantime, what's Russia's response to this? Well, it is revising its nuclear doctrine, according to Dmitry Peskov here, as reported by Reuters. So this an extremely dangerous situation. The fact is, this is not an issue which is an election issue, as far as I can see at this point, aside from the comments that Farage may have made a few days ago. I think this needs to be an issue for the election. So I think everybody needs to be getting out there and making it an issue for the election. And that's what I would encourage. Okay, where does that take us then? Africa, Charles.
Yeah, it does, Mike. Yeah, thanks very much. We'll just play a video now while I speak over the top of it. This is from Nairobi, scenes of the last scenes from the last 24 hours or so, in which there's been widespread rioting, looting, call it what you will, in government buildings. And essentially this is shown by Al Jazeera, but it's in response to a couple of very controversial pieces of legislation. Now, whilst this focus obviously is on what's happened in the parliament in Kenya, the lessons really are to be drawn for everybody, because it just shows how precarious, in a way, we all are when sort of legislation like this is put forward. That particularly was concerning the finance bill, and we'll just have a look at what the government put out in terms of debt management for the year. So the Treasury and Economic Planning Group put out their medium-term debt strategy, and they absolutely spelt it out, to be fair to them. The government will continue implementing growth-responsive fiscal consolidation through broadening of tax revenue base and rationalisation of expenditures in order to reduce the fiscal deficits. It's just worth drawing out there that the public debt, they say, is at 68.2% of GDP, whereas in the UK at the moment, the latest statistics from the ONS say that we're at 98.3%. But nonetheless, the other part of legislation that is in effect much more controversial is the Land Law Amendment Bill, or at least in some respect, which I'll just explain in a second. And in particular here, we see that this clause states that the owner of any freehold land or property situated within the boundaries of any urban area or city shall pay an annual land levy equivalent to land rent charged on a comparable leasehold land or property of the same size in the same zone. So obviously that's a slightly complicated way of saying that it doesn't matter whether you were previously a freeholder. To all intents and purposes, you are now a leaseholder. And of course, that could be something that is taken on by any other administration anywhere in the world. Concurrent with this is a memorandum from the United States designating Kenya as a major non-NATO ally, of which there are 18 existing ones. But you might be interested to know what the privileges of such an appointment are, particularly in light of the situation not just in the Middle East, but also with Ukraine and Russia, and indeed the sort of worldwide financial situation. So that you're eligible for loans of material, supplies or equipment for cooperative research, development, testing or evaluation purposes, critically as a location for US-owned war reserve stockpiles to be placed on your territory outside of US military facilities. Also, you're eligible to enter into an MOU or formal agreement for the purpose of conducting cooperative research and development projects on defense equipment and munitions. And again, just following Mike's segment, you're eligible for consideration to purchase depleted uranium ammunition. So these might seem slightly disconnected, but in effect, we've got protests generated by the increase of a number of taxes, some of which had been scrapped even prior to it going to the House for the final time, and it now requires presidential assent. But that's been enough to tip people into this sort of behaviour. Exactly how it's been incited or orchestrated doesn't really yet seem clear, but police are reckoned to have shot dead a number of people through the day and indeed through last night. So appalling scenes there. But the underlying point, of course, is that the economic vulnerability of that country and that region, and in particular the strategic significance, the geopolitical and military significance of East Africa and the Horn of Africa, and the interest from both Russia and China and the United States feeling like it needs to make a countermeasure in order to assert both military and economic control, is something that we'll have to keep a very close eye on.
Yes, indeed. Okay, thank you, Charles. And we're just going to end with this piece of news. So first of all, this is the National Crime Agency press release on the so-called leader of Lockbit, which is a cybercrime gang. They run, these sort of ransomware attacks on various organizations that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. Why am I mentioning this? Well, they are claiming on their channels that they have managed to hack the Federal Reserve Bank, that they have obtained 33 terabytes of data from the Federal Reserve Bank, and that they're going to publish it unless the Federal Reserve pays up in Bitcoin. So we'll be watching this story as it develops and see whether they do actually publish this data. Once again, we have the biggest organizations on the planet absolutely unable to protect themselves from this type of activity. Of course, the National Crime Agency attempting to draw connections between these guys and the Russian government and Putin in particular, because we shouldn't miss the type of opportunity to draw these types of connections and make sure that Putin is getting the blame for everything. But nonetheless, we will watch this story, and if that data is published, we'll let you know. But we'll leave it there for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa and Charles for joining us today, and to everybody that's watched. Stick around if you're a UK column member for some extra in a couple of minutes. But if you're not a member and you'd like to watch extra, please join us. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.